June 19, 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Before dawn broke over the Pacific, Task Force 58 cut a steady wake some 200 miles west of the Marianas. The sea was calm, the air already tense. On the decks of USS Enterprise, Lexington, Bunker Hill, Yorktown, and 11 other American carriers, hundreds of aircraft were poised like a coiled fist. At 0830 hours, waves of F6F Hellcats thundered into the sky, 905 aircraft in all, under the command of Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher aboard Lexington. For the Americans, this was the culmination of years of attrition and engineering. For Japan's naval air arm, it would be the day that shattered an entire military philosophy. On the Japanese side, Lieutenant Warrant Officer Sakio Komatsu fastened his harness in the ready room of the carrier Taiyo. The men had been briefed just after sunrise. American carriers were operating east of Guam, grouped in massive formations. Japanese scouts claimed 15 floating fortresses advancing toward the Marianas. The strike order called for an all-out offensive, 2 waves of aircraft intended to crush the U.S. invasion fleet before it reached the homeland's defensive perimeter. Komatsu's fighter carried an auxiliary drop tank beneath the fuselage, pushing his range beyond 1,000 nautical miles. It was a trade-off of agility for endurance, but one considered essential for a mission of such distance. Like his comrades, he believed this might be the decisive blow that would halt the American tide. The strategy guiding this sortie had its roots in Japan's early war triumphs. The attack doctrine, perfected during the campaigns of 1941 to 1942, emphasized the Zero's unmatched agility and extraordinary range. Tactics developed under Commander Minoru Genda taught pilots to use the aircraft's superior turning radius and stamina to compensate for being outnumbered. Against the slower, heavier Allied planes of those years, it worked with devastating effect. From Pearl Harbor to Darwin and the Dutch East Indies, skilled pilots could outmaneuver nearly any foe, winning by exploiting energy and position rather than brute strength. But by mid-1944, the air war had evolved, and so had the machines that ruled it. Task Force 58 was unlike anything the Imperial Navy had ever faced. The 15 American carriers, including 6 of the new Essex class, represented not only naval power, but an industrial achievement unmatched in wartime history. Each 27,000-ton ship carried reinforced steel decks, specialized workshops, and intricate fire suppression systems, features that sacrifice speed for sheer resilience. Japanese carriers, designed with light frames to maximize aircraft capacity, could not withstand similar punishment. The contrast mirrored the broader war: quality over fragility, engineering precision over daring improvisation. Among the American aircraft, the Grumman F6F Hellcat stood as a direct response to the Zero menace. Introduced only months earlier, it embodied every lesson learned from Pacific combat. Weighing 12,000 pounds and driven by a 2,000-horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine, the Hellcat could reach 380 miles per hour and climb efficiently even when armored. Behind the cockpit, steel plates shielded the pilot, while self-sealing fuel tanks drastically reduced fire risk. 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, each loaded with 400 rounds, gave it an offensive punch that far outclassed anything in the Japanese arsenal. The aircraft was rugged, forgiving, and built for pilots who might be on their first mission, precisely what the war now demanded.
At 24,000 feet, 128 Japanese planes, fighters and bombers from the carriers Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku pressed eastward toward the American formation. For a time, the sky seemed empty. The radar silence convinced many they had achieved surprise. But within minutes, that illusion would vanish. Hidden far above, Hellcats waited, guided by airborne radar systems Japan had never seen. Most of the Japanese pilots had barely 100 flight hours to their names. Wartime attrition had stripped the Imperial Navy of its veteran airmen. What once required 3 years of training was now compressed into 6 months. Basic air combat instruction was sacrificed for navigation drills. Carrier landings, the most dangerous phase of naval flying, were practiced only a handful of times before deployment. In the lead element flew Ensign Takeshi Yamamoto, one of the few surviving veterans from the early conquests. With over 600 combat hours, he had fought above Rabaul and the Dutch East Indies, back when the Zero seemed unbeatable. In those days, Japanese pilots spoke of the spirit of the samurai in the sky. But as Yamamoto glanced upward through the blinding morning haze, the faint glint of American fighters descending from the sun marked the beginning of a new era, one where spirit alone could no longer command the heavens. By mid-1942, cracks had begun to show in Japan's once invincible air doctrine. The campaign for Guadalcanal marked a turning point in the Pacific Air War, exposing weaknesses in both aircraft design and pilot training. American aviators, having studied the Zero's patterns, developed new tactics that neutralized its traditional strengths. The so-called thatch weave, a defensive maneuver relying on teamwork and timing, allowed U.S. fighters to counter the Zero's legendary agility. Meanwhile, high-speed boom and zoom attacks exploited its fragile frame and lack of armor. What had once been an unmatched predator of the skies was beginning to look vulnerable. Aboard the carrier Taiho, Ensign Hiroshi Tanaka prepared for what would be his first true test of combat. Barely 10 weeks earlier, he had completed a severely shortened flight course, logging just 75 hours in the air. His training, stripped to essentials due to dwindling fuel and ammunition supplies, consisted mostly of theory and basic navigation. The harsh reality of war meant that many new Japanese pilots entered battle without ever having fired at a moving aerial target. Veterans like Lieutenant Yamamoto, Tanaka's section leader, now carried a double burden, fighting experienced American pilots while trying to keep their inexperienced wingmen alive. This mentoring responsibility, though born of necessity, drained focus and diluted the effectiveness of Japanese formations in the heat of battle. On the American side, an entirely different picture was unfolding. Aboard USS Yorktown, radar operators picked up the Japanese strike at a distance of 150 miles, enough time to organize a precise interception. In the carrier's Combat Information Center, a team of trained officers plotted enemy positions in real time. Through radio links, they directed groups of Hellcats toward ideal attack vectors, dictating altitude, heading, and timing. This networked command system, refined through years of trial and error, transformed aerial warfare. It allowed the U.S. Navy to shift from reactive defense to orchestrated interception, where every fighter moved as part of a single, coordinated machine. From USS Essex, Commander David McCampbell, leading Fighter Squadron 15, climbed with his 12 Hellcats into the morning sky. Each pilot under his command was a product of an intensive training pipeline that emphasized not only flight hours, over 500 by graduation, but also tactical comprehension. Their education went beyond simple aerobatics. They practiced deflection shooting, energy management, and formation tactics against mock adversaries designed to replicate Japanese performance. By 1944, the United States was producing more than 10,000 naval aviators per year, each trained to fight as a team rather than as an individual duelist. The Hellcat itself embodied this doctrine of survivability and dominance. Its designers at Grumman had built the aircraft not merely to outperform the Zero, but to outlast it. Reinforced steel plating encased the cockpit. Seatback, headrest, and flooring alone adding more than 200 pounds of protection. Its thick, laminated windshield could deflect 7.7 millimeters at close range, and the self-sealing fuel tanks were a marvel of practical engineering, swelling shut when punctured to prevent fire. The aircraft's sturdy frame could endure multiple cannon hits and still return home, a fact proven repeatedly in test trials and combat alike. The result was a machine that inspired immense confidence. Pilots knew their chances of survival were tied not only to skill, but to the resilience of the aircraft itself. At 9:15 hours, 90 miles west of Guam, the opposing forces finally met. The Japanese formation, 128 aircraft strong, encountered the first wave of Hellcats diving from high altitude. The Americans struck from above and behind, their superior climb and speed translating into devastating momentum. Ensign Tanaka, reacting instinctively, banked hard left to evade his pursuer. But the Hellcat, with its immense power, stayed locked on his tail through the turn. Moments later, .50 caliber rounds ripped through the Zero's fuselage, shattering control cables and puncturing its unprotected fuel tanks. Within seconds, the aircraft was engulfed in flames, then vanished in a violent explosion. The scene was a brutal reminder that the days of the Zero's dominance were over. Across the sky, Commander McCampbell's division executed carefully timed slashing attacks. Each run began from 28,000 feet, the Hellcats diving at nearly 450 miles per hour before zooming back to altitude to reset. The Japanese tried to force turning fights, but the Americans refused the trap, maintaining speed and altitude, an energy-based warfare style that stripped the Zero of its last advantages. The U.S. formations fought not as individuals, but as cohesive units, wingmen guarding each other's blind spots, maintaining formation discipline even amid chaos. Clear, reliable radio communication tied every move together, in stark contrast to the Japanese, whose unreliable transmitters often filled cockpits with static. Many Japanese pilots resorted to hand signals and pre-planned maneuvers, methods hopelessly outdated in the face of modern coordination. In less than an hour, the sky above Guam told a clear story. The legendary agility of the Zero had met its technological countermeasure, and the once feared Japanese air arm found itself overwhelmed by a combination of superior machines, rigorous training, and integrated command systems. The aerial supremacy Japan once held through daring and intuition was now undone by the cold precision of radar, radios, and reinforced steel. A shift that signaled not just the loss of a battle, but the end of an era in aviation warfare. Breakdowns in Japanese aerial communication quickly turned tactical disadvantages into strategic collapses, as their formations fractured under the precision of coordinated American fighter attacks. The first clash lasted less than 10 minutes, but cost Japan a dozen Zero fighters, torn apart by concentrated bursts from Hellcats, whose pilots operated with almost mechanical efficiency. Observers aboard American carriers noted surprising deficiencies in enemy gunnery. Their tracers arced harmlessly past targets, and evasive rolls followed repetitive, easily anticipated patterns. It became evident that many Japanese aviators lacked combat depth. Their actions suggested minimal tactical variation and poor understanding of energy-based maneuvering. Several even relinquished advantageous positions, apparently confused or unable to capitalize on fleeting openings during close engagements. Among the American pilots, Lieutenant Alexander Vatz of VF-16 aboard USS Lexington intercepted a secondary enemy formation that attempted to breach the fighter perimeter. With just 4 Hellcats against a dozen Zeros, his section executed a textbook engagement. Within 8 minutes, 6 enemy planes had fallen. Vatz expended barely 1/6 of his ammunition, evidence of the superior marksmanship training that characterized the U.S. Navy's aviators. The destructive potential of 6 .50 caliber Browning machine guns concentrated on the lightly built Zeros was staggering. Short, accurate bursts shattered wings, ignited fuel tanks, and tore engines apart. Proof that technology, not numbers, was dictating the outcome. As the combat unfolded, the technological gulf widened further. The Hellcat's armored structure absorbed multiple 7.7mm hits with negligible impact, while the Zero disintegrated under even brief fire. American pilots described watching enemy aircraft vanish in fiery explosions within seconds of being hit.
Although Japanese fighters carried 20mm cannons theoretically capable of devastating damage, their slow projectile speed, limited ammunition, and hasty firing squandered that advantage. Most Zero pilots depleted their cannon rounds within moments of combat, leaving them armed only with rifle-caliber guns that were largely ineffective against American aircraft. Radar-controlled fighter direction turned the air defense network into a coordinated machine. From the carriers below, radar operators and fighter director officers maintained a live picture of the aerial battlefield. Each new wave of interceptors was vectored precisely to altitude and bearing, ensuring they met incoming raids at favorable positions. The result was a series of perfectly timed interceptions that shattered Japanese coordination. Instead of arriving in overwhelming force, enemy squadrons appeared in scattered groups, meeting concentrated resistance before they could form up for attack.
Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's second wave, launched shortly before 900 hours, mustered 128 aircraft, a mix of Zeros, Judys, and Jills, intended to overwhelm the American task force through massed numbers. Yet this force was crippled from the start. Many of its inexperienced pilots struggled with long-range navigation. Formations dispersed over hundreds of miles, and several groups became completely disoriented, burning through fuel in futile attempts to locate their targets. When USS Cowpan's fighter groups, led by Lieutenant Russell Reiser of VF-31, intercepted the leading elements 60 miles from the fleet, the Japanese never saw them coming. Attacking out of the sun, the Hellcats descended in blinding surprise. Within moments, 5 enemy planes spiraled into the sea, their burning wreckage marking the futility of the assault. The remaining Japanese aircraft pressed on in disorganized clusters, only to be met by successive layers of American fighters operating at staggered altitudes. Each encounter followed the same pattern: steep diving attacks, short bursts of gunfire, and rapid climbs back to altitude. The Hellcats maintained complete control of engagement tempo, always attacking from a position of advantage, never drawn into turning battles where the Zero once excelled. This mastery of energy tactics reflected rigorous U.S. training focused on altitude, speed management, and teamwork. In contrast, Japanese pilots, conditioned for close-in dogfights, found their machines sluggish and unresponsive at the higher speeds now demanded by modern combat. By the time remnants of Ozawa's strike reached the American task force, they were isolated, exhausted, and flying into a storm of anti-aircraft fire. Destroyers and cruisers threw up dense barrages of flak, forcing surviving bombers to scatter. Only one torpedo run was completed, against the battleship USS Indiana, which turned sharply to avoid the weapon. No American ship was struck. At 1100 hours, Commander McCampbell of VF-15 led another division into battle, intercepting what remained of the third Japanese attack wave. His 12 Hellcats engaged more than 40 enemy aircraft in a 20-minute engagement that epitomized the efficiency of American air power. McCampbell himself downed 7 aircraft. His wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, added 4 more. Each maneuver reflected perfect coordination, with wing pairs covering one another through attack runs and recovery climbs. For the Japanese, the battle devolved into chaos. Formations dissolved, discipline vanished, and pilots abandoned their strike mission in desperate attempts to survive. Lieutenant Commander Kenji Suzuki, limping home in a Zero riddled with .5 caliber holes, witnessed the annihilation firsthand. His control cables were shredded, one engine cylinder was destroyed, and he could barely keep the aircraft aloft. For Japan's naval air arm, the losses exceeded even those at Midway. Yet unlike that earlier battle, not a single meaningful hit was scored against the American fleet. When the few surviving pilots returned, they brought reports that stunned their commanders. They had encountered a completely new American fighter whose power, protection, and speed rendered all prior assumptions obsolete. The myth of Japanese aerial superiority, once unquestioned, had ended in the skies over the Philippine Sea.
Pre-war Japanese intelligence assessments, drawn from technical evaluations of captured F-4F Wildcats, had fostered an enduring confidence in the Zero's supremacy. Reports insisted that American fighters, though rugged, lagged behind Japan's latest models in agility, climb rate, and sustained turning performance, surpassing them only in dive speed. That belief shattered the moment the F6F Hellcat entered combat. In a single campaign, it overturned every principle on which Japanese aerial strategy had rested. The new U.S. fighter not only matched, but surpassed the Zero's capabilities at almost every altitude. It climbed faster, retained maneuverability at higher speeds, and endured punishment that would shred a lighter airframe. To Japanese tacticians, the Hellcat seemed designed specifically to erase the Zero's strengths while exploiting every vulnerability that years of war had exposed. Aboard the carrier Taiho, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa received fragmented and grim radio messages as the morning battles unfolded. Pilots reported overwhelming swarms of American fighters appearing simultaneously from multiple altitudes and directions, disrupting every attempt at coordination. The U.S. fleet's radar-guided defense network prevented Japanese aircraft from massing for a unified strike. The system was so precise and adaptable that each Japanese assault wave disintegrated under layered interception, losing cohesion before even sighting their targets. Intercepted communications confirmed what Ozawa already feared. While American losses remained negligible, Japan's carrier groups were being annihilated. By early afternoon, the scale of the disaster became undeniable. The first assault wave had launched 69 aircraft, barely 27 made it back. Many of those were riddled with bullet holes, leaking fuel, or barely capable of flight. The second wave, consisting of 128 planes, fared even worse. Scarcely a third survived the gauntlet of American fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Beyond the wrecked planes lay an even greater catastrophe, the irreplaceable loss of trained pilots. Japan's pre-war training pipeline, once the envy of the Pacific, could no longer produce replacements fast enough to sustain combat operations. Each downed aviator represented years of investment and experience that wartime programs could not replicate. What had begun as a tactical setback was rapidly evolving into the collapse of Japan's naval air arm. Those who returned to their carriers brought with them an unfamiliar expression: fear. Young pilots who had graduated from shortened flight programs mere weeks earlier described encounters with an enemy seemingly immune to damage. Their own 7.7mm guns appeared useless, while the Americans' 50 caliber fire tore through their aircraft like paper. The legend of the Zero's invincibility, once a source of national pride, dissolved in a single morning. Veteran officers such as Commander Yamamoto found themselves confronting the impossible. The doctrines that had carried Japan to victory in China, the Philippines, and the early Pacific battles no longer applied. Years of tactical mastery were rendered irrelevant by a foe who refused to fight under familiar conditions. The spiritual foundation of Japanese aviation, the belief in skill and courage as substitutes for material power, collapsed as visibly as the burning aircraft that dotted the sea. On the flight decks, the human cost of defeat was unmistakable. Maintenance crews stared at empty parking lines where aircraft should have been. Men who only hours earlier had fueled, armed, and launched fighters now stood idle amid silence, their tools useless. The decks of Shokaku and Zuikaku, designed to host 70-plus aircraft, held barely a handful of battered survivors. Mechanics searched the horizon for returning comrades who would never reappear. The sense of desolation spread quickly through the task force. Morale plunged, and the optimism that had preceded the operation vanished entirely.
Admiral Ozawa, facing the wreckage of his air power, weighed the unthinkable, aborting the offensive. Yet withdrawal meant conceding Saipan and the Central Pacific to the Americans, an admission that Japan had lost the decisive struggle for naval supremacy. Still, continuing the battle seemed equally futile. Reconnaissance confirmed that U.S. carrier groups retained full operational strength despite absorbing 3 successive strikes. A fourth wave of 82 aircraft waited on deck, but committing them promised nothing but further slaughter. Ozawa understood that his fleet could no longer match the enemy, either in numbers or in machines. Inside the flagship's operations centers, chaos replaced clarity. Communications between senior staff and frontline squadrons had broken down completely. Fragmentary after-action reports contradicted each other, leaving commanders blind to the true scale of the disaster. Analysts struggled to compile coherent assessments as returning pilots delivered disjointed accounts of new American aircraft that defied every known specification. Yet cultural conditioning stifled frank discussion. The Imperial Navy's ingrained belief in moral resolve over material strength made many officers unwilling to confront the obvious truth that technology, not spirit, now decided battles. In reality, the F6F Hellcat owed its dominance to engineering superiority as much as pilot training. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double-wasp engine produced roughly 2,000 horsepower, nearly twice the output of the Zero's Nakajima Sakai 21. That power differential translated directly into climb rate, acceleration, and ceiling advantage. The Hellcat could ascend at 3,500 feet per minute compared to the Zero's 2,600, enabling it to dictate altitude and energy in every engagement. Its rugged frame and heavy armor allowed it to survive hits that would instantly cripple lighter fighters. Most decisive of all was its firepower. 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, each with 400 rounds, delivering concentrated ballistic energy far superior to the mixed, low-velocity armament of Japanese aircraft. Together, these features redefined the balance of aerial combat. The Hellcat was not merely an improved fighter. It was the embodiment of America's industrial might, designed for survivability, endurance, and lethal efficiency. Against it, the Zero's once-celebrated agility became irrelevant. What unfolded over the Philippine Sea was more than a battle. It was the visible triumph of technological evolution over tradition, a moment when mastery of machinery replaced valor as the decisive factor in war. Each of the Hellcat's 6 Browning .50 caliber guns unleashed a torrent of 850 rounds per minute, their projectiles leaving the barrels at nearly 2,900 feet per second. This immense muzzle velocity produced a flat, stable trajectory, granting both accuracy and penetrating power at extended combat ranges. Together, these guns could deliver over 100 armor-piercing incendiary rounds every second, enough to punch through engine casings and set fuel tanks ablaze. With sufficient ammunition for a full half-minute of continuous fire, American pilots could engage multiple enemies without the constant anxiety of running dry in the middle of a fight.
In contrast, the Zero's weapon layout, 2 20mm Type 99 cannons and a pair of 7.7mm Type 97 machine guns offered theoretical advantages that rarely translated to battlefield success. The heavy cannons, despite their destructive shells, fired at a modest velocity of around 2,460 feet per second, causing rounds to drop steeply over distance and requiring pilots to aim well above their targets. Worse still, with only 60 rounds per gun, Japanese aviators were forced to fire sparingly. The twin 7.7mm guns, though faster firing, lacked the force to pierce the thick armor of American aircraft, their bullets bouncing harmlessly from Hellcat fuselages. The end result was an aircraft whose mixed-caliber armament demanded precision marksmanship few could maintain under pressure, and which offered little forgiveness in extended combat. While Japanese pilots fought under the limitations of their aging technology, American crews enjoyed the invisible protection of advanced electronics. Shipborne radar systems, notably the SK Air Search Set, could identify incoming formations over 100 miles away. Complementary SM radar units determined altitude to within 500 feet, feeding exact data to the combat information centers aboard each carrier. There, trained officers plotted every contact on vertical glass displays, updating fighter directors who coordinated intercepts through reliable VHF radio channels. The entire process turned air defense into a calculated science. Squadrons launched, vectored, and engaged according to precise instructions rather than individual intuition. On the Japanese side, such sophistication was missing. A handful of carriers carried the unreliable Type 21 radar, its range limited to roughly 60 miles and prone to false echoes. With no height-finding capability or integrated communication network, Japanese combat air patrols operated in isolation, adhering to outdated doctrines that relied on visual sighting and rigid pre-war formations. This lack of centralized control meant that defending fighters were often misplaced or too late to meet incoming raids. As the Americans coordinated their air defense like a single organism, the Japanese response remained fragmented and reactive, a fatal disadvantage in modern aerial warfare. By 1944, these systemic weaknesses extended to the very heart of Japan's air arm, its pilots. The once elite naval aviators of 1941 were now a fading generation, replaced by hastily trained recruits. The typical graduate of the Imperial Navy's pilot program that year logged barely 40 flight hours before being sent to the front. Their American counterparts, by comparison, averaged over 500. The U.S. Navy's intensive gunnery schools used camera-mounted guns to assess accuracy during mock engagements, while advanced training emphasized formation tactics, coordinated teamwork, and energy management. Newly minted aviators completed operational courses under the supervision of combat veterans returning from the front, ensuring that every lesson was grounded in practical experience. In Japan, the opposite was true. The shortage of fuel and modern trainers forced instructors to rely on classroom lectures and outdated aircraft. Ammunition scarcity meant many young pilots had never fired at a moving target before their first real combat. Precision flying replaced adaptability. Formation practice resembled parade drills rather than flexible air combat maneuvers. Aerobatics, instrument flight, and night training, all staples of the pre-war syllabus, were abandoned to save time and resources. This decline in training quality, combined with inferior equipment, turned every air battle into a grim arithmetic of attrition.
Despite catastrophic losses during the morning's engagements, Admiral Ozawa ordered one final offensive, a desperate fourth wave totaling 82 aircraft. His intent was simple: inflict any possible damage on the American carrier groups before retreating westward. But by then, Task Force 58 had already regained full operational rhythm. Its fighters refueled, rearmed, and relaunched in relentless cycles. As the remaining Japanese aircraft approached, they were met by layers of Hellcats stacked at multiple altitudes. The interception unfolded with mechanical precision. By 2:30 p.m., American reconnaissance planes had already sighted Ozawa's main fleet 275 miles to the west-northwest, prompting Admiral Mark Mitcher to authorize a massive retaliatory strike. A total of 216 aircraft, among them 85 Hellcats, launched from U.S. decks, pushing the limits of their range in one of the war's most ambitious offensive sorties. This marked a dramatic shift in tempo. The morning's defenders had now become the attackers. In contrast, the Japanese carriers, stripped of their air cover, could muster only a few dozen fighters for defense. The result was devastating. The Ho went down under multiple torpedo hits. Zuikaku and Shiota sustained crippling bomb damage. Anti-aircraft fire, erratic and poorly coordinated, could not stem the assault. American pilots trained in synchronized attack patterns pressed home their strikes with precision that mirrored the efficiency of their machines. As night fell, a new peril arose: returning home. The distance and fading light left hundreds of American pilots struggling to locate their carriers. In a bold and unprecedented move, Admiral Mitcher ordered the fleet to switch on every light: searchlights, signal lamps, even flight deck beacons. The risk of drawing submarines was immense, yet the decision saved lives. Though estimated 80 planes were lost to fuel exhaustion or night landing mishaps, rescue efforts recovered 85% of the downed airmen, with destroyers plucking survivors from the dark sea. By dawn, the scale of the American triumph was complete. Ozawa's surviving ships limped westward with only 35 functional aircraft out of the 430 that had taken off that morning. The fleet that had sailed forth in search of decisive victory now returned broken and beaten, achieving nothing except confirmation of Japan's aerial inferiority. The loss ratio was staggering. 10 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every American lost. The Imperial Navy's air arm, once the terror of the Pacific, had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. In the early years of the Pacific War, Japanese aviators carried a psychological edge into battle. Allied pilots, haunted by the reputation of the Zero fighter, often entered combat expecting defeat before the first burst of gunfire. That sense of inevitability dissolved the moment the F6F Hellcat appeared in the skies. Designed from the outset as a counter to the Zero strengths, it overturned the mental balance of air warfare. American engineers accepted extra weight for protection, armor plating, bulletproof glass, and self-sealing fuel tanks that transformed survivability. Where a single hit could ignite a Zero, a Hellcat could limp home riddled with holes. Its 2,000 horsepower engine granted the performance to climb or dive at will, allowing pilots to fight only when and how they chose. 6 heavy .50 caliber Browning guns, firing in unison, tore through Japanese aircraft built with minimal structural reinforcement. For the first time, the enemy's supposed superiority dissolved in a storm of lead and fire.
The Hellcat's emergence symbolized more than mechanical evolution. It represented the triumph of an industrial system over a handcrafted tradition. Japan's approach to aerial warfare had rested on the artistry of elite pilots trained over many years. The United States embraced scale and method, while Japan struggled to produce hundreds of replacements through hurried, shortened courses. America was training thousands through a standardized curriculum grounded in scientific analysis and operational feedback. Flight schools functioned like assembly lines, ensuring every pilot met uniform standards in gunnery, formation tactics, and navigation. Experience was no longer irreplaceable. Each new aviator could step seamlessly into the cockpit and perform his role within the larger machine of naval aviation. It was a shift from craftsmanship to industry, from heroism to system. Technology amplified this new doctrine. The radar-directed fighter control network became the unseen weapon that defined the American advantage. Long-range search radars detected enemy formations far beyond visual range, while dedicated combat information centers coordinated the response. Fighter direction officers could position interceptors precisely, ensuring Japanese attacks were met head-on before their pilots even saw the target. This integration of sensors, communication, and command transformed the aircraft carrier from a vulnerable floating airfield into a fortress protected by invisible guardians. Each element, radar, radio, and disciplined coordination, created a combined capability far greater than the sum of its parts. Against this seamless system, the Japanese reliance on visual spotting and individual initiative appeared archaic, a relic of an earlier age. The Imperial Navy's unwillingness to adapt its doctrine sealed its fate. Pre-war strategy had centered on seeking a single decisive clash, one grand carrier engagement that would determine control of the Pacific. But the Americans refused to play by those rules. They pursued a slower, grinding campaign of attrition, confident that time and production would work in their favor. Industrial output, patient operational planning, and technological coordination combined to make victory inevitable. Japan's emphasis on the spirit and skill of individual pilots could not compensate for this growing disparity. The loss of each veteran flyer represented not only a human tragedy, but the erosion of institutional knowledge that had taken years to cultivate. Wartime pilot programs could not reproduce the mastery of the pre-war elite, producing flyers barely competent to handle their aircraft in combat. The cycle of loss and replacement became self-perpetuating. Inexperienced airmen died quickly, leaving fewer mentors for those who followed.
While Japanese morale crumbled, Task Force 58 maintained relentless pressure around Saipan. On June 20th, American carrier groups resumed their search for the shattered enemy fleet while continuing to guard the ongoing invasion below. Pilots returning from the previous day's engagements spoke of the experience with grim humor, calling it a turkey shoot, a phrase that would forever define the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The description, crude though it was, captured the reality of the encounter. An aerial massacre conducted with mechanical precision. By the end of the fighting, the statistics told the story plainly. Japan had lost 445 aircraft, nearly 400 from its carrier decks, and another 50 from land bases, while the Americans recorded just 123 losses, most of them due to operational mishaps rather than combat. Only 43 U.S. planes fell to Japanese guns. The exchange ratio, 10-to-1, dwarfed every previous carrier battle, including the famed victory at Midway. More devastating than the aircraft losses was the disappearance of Japan's last reservoir of experienced aviators. Among the fallen were training instructors recalled from flight schools, the final generation capable of mentoring new pilots. Admiral Ozawa's report to Combined Fleet Headquarters acknowledged what could no longer be denied. Japanese carrier aviation had ceased to exist as an offensive force. His surviving ships still floated, and some aircraft still sat on their decks, but there were no pilots left with the skill to use them effectively. The mobile fleet, envisioned as the instrument of Japan's decisive victory, returned home as little more than a ghost, its purpose erased by overwhelming American air power.
The consequences reached far beyond that single engagement. The road to Japan now lay open. There would be no further carrier battles to halt the American advance. The Battle of the Philippine Sea became more than a military success. It was a demonstration of the future of naval warfare. The marriage of radar, communications, and centralized fighter control created a model every major navy would later imitate. The focus on protecting pilots through armored aircraft, structured training, and systemic efficiency replaced the old romantic belief in sacrifice and individual valor. Even after the war, the Hellcat continued to serve, its rugged airframe adapted for ground attack duties in Korea, a lasting symbol of the industrial and doctrinal revolution it embodied. Ultimately, America's victory in the Philippine Sea was decided not by luck or courage alone, but by the convergence of technology, discipline, and production. The United States could replace every plane lost many times over, while Japan's every loss marked the permanent erosion of its strength. The Hellcat's roar signaled more than dominance in the air. It declared the arrival of a new age in warfare, where mass production, systematic training, and coordinated technology had rendered the old order of aerial dueling obsolete. In that transformation, the myth of invincible Japanese air power was not merely broken, it was erased. By mid-1944, the vast imbalance between American and Japanese production capacity had become a defining feature of the Pacific War. The statistics themselves told a story of inevitability. In that year alone, U.S. factories turned out roughly 96,000 aircraft of every type, fighters, bombers, and patrol planes, while Japan, despite mobilizing its entire economy for war, could barely complete 28,000. The industrial gap had grown so wide that strategy, doctrine, and even courage could no longer bridge it. Against this backdrop, the Grumman F6F Hellcat emerged as the supreme instrument of American air power, a machine that epitomized both technological refinement and mass production efficiency. No other Allied fighter achieved such extraordinary results. Official combat tallies credited the Hellcat with 5,223 enemy aircraft destroyed, for only 270 losses in aerial engagements, a staggering 19-to-1 ratio unmatched by any other type. Although it joined the fleet halfway through the conflict, it accounted for nearly 3/4 of all Navy air victories.
pilots repeatedly testified to the aircraft's forgiving flight characteristics, its solid construction, and its ability to keep flying after sustaining heavy damage. Where earlier American planes demanded precision and luck to survive, the Hellcat absorbed punishment that would have obliterated lighter designs. Its creators valued endurance, visibility, and firepower over sheer maneuverability, and the philosophy proved decisive. The same could not be said for Japan's air arm, which never recovered from the catastrophe over the Marianas. What had once been an elite force of naval aviators, the pride of the empire, was reduced to desperation. With training pipelines shattered and veterans dead, the Imperial Navy resorted to suicidal tactics, hurling poorly trained pilots on one-way missions that achieved little more than tragedy. The knowledge accumulated through decades of development and experimentation vanished within a single day's fighting against better-equipped opponents. The legendary Zero, once a symbol of aerial dominance, came to represent fragility and obsolescence in the face of modern engineering. On a deeper level, the defeat forced an entire nation to confront the uncomfortable truth that willpower and faith alone could not offset industrial inferiority. The myth that spiritual purity could triumph over material strength died in the Philippine Sea. For the United States, the battle marked the culmination of a transformation that had begun amid the ashes of Pearl Harbor. In less than 3 years, the Navy rebuilt its carrier arm not only in numbers, but in concept. The few task forces that had survived 1941 now returned magnified tenfold: better aircraft, better pilots, and doctrine grounded in relentless analysis. The Hellcat symbolized that evolution. It was no longer a reaction to enemy advantage, but an instrument of calculated dominance. Admiral Mark Mitcher's after-action assessment described the victory as absolute, though he recognized the favorable circumstances that had concentrated Japanese attacks against an alert, well-prepared defense. He credited radar-directed interception, effective communication, and superior aircraft as the key factors that turned potential chaos into orchestrated success. Yet Mitcher also warned against complacency, predicting that future adversaries might resort to unconventional tactics that could bypass technological superiority, a foresight that would prove accurate when kamikaze assaults emerged months later.
Behind the numbers lay the human experience of those who fought the battle. American aviators, trained to machine-like precision, found themselves downing enemy aircraft with startling ease, often expressing a conflicted sympathy for their outmatched opponents. Some described watching Japanese planes disintegrate after mere seconds of gunfire, unable to comprehend how a contest once so perilous had become one-sided slaughter. On the other side, Japanese survivors spoke of shock and despair, of formations wiped out before they could fire a shot, of comrades vanishing in fireballs without warning. Their accounts stripped away abstraction and revealed the human cost of technological imbalance, courage undone by inevitability. The engagement that history would remember as the Marianas Turkey Shoot thus became more than a military episode. It was a moment when the industrial and scientific revolutions of the 20th century collided with the warrior ethos of the past. The Hellcat's success, born of engineering pragmatism and systematic training, confirmed that victory in modern warfare belonged to those who could merge intellect, production, and organization. Japan's vision of a decisive, heroic battle led by elite airmen perished in the skies it once ruled. By June 1944, the Imperial Navy's striking arm, so dominant in 1942, had ceased to function as an offensive force. The aftermath carried profound strategic implications. Japan's leaders could no longer deny that the empire lacked the material foundation to sustain the war. Every factory lost to bombing, every ship sunk, widened an already fatal gap. Yet surrender remained unthinkable. Cultural and ideological rigidity prevented honest acknowledgement of defeat, creating a psychological rift between reason and belief.
From that tension emerged the phenomenon of the kamikaze, the desperate expression of a nation that could not win, yet refused to yield. It was less a strategy than an admission of collapse, a final attempt to reclaim meaning from inevitable failure. The disaster of the Philippine Sea was compounded when on June 19th, two major Japanese carriers, Shokaku and Taiho, were struck down by American submarines. Shokaku, a veteran of Pearl Harbor and nearly every carrier battle since, was fatally torpedoed by USS Kavala as she refueled her aircraft. Taiho, Japan's newest and most advanced carrier, succumbed later that day to internal explosions triggered by gasoline vapors after a single torpedo hit. These losses, combined with the annihilation of the air groups, left the Imperial Navy with little more than the empty shells of a once formidable force. In the end, the statistics, 5,000 Hellcat victories, 445 Japanese planes lost in one battle, production ratios of 4-to-1, were not mere numbers, they represented the transformation of warfare itself. The skies above the Marianas proved that courage and skill, however noble, could not prevail against a nation that had mastered the art of modern war. The Philippine Sea was not only Japan's greatest defeat, it was the moment the old world of aerial combat gave way to the mechanized age. Japan's newest carrier, Taiho, the pride of its rebuilt fleet and the first to feature an armored flight deck, met its end with brutal suddenness. A single torpedo, fired by the submarine USS Albacore, ruptured her fuel system and triggered a chain of internal vapor explosions that tore through the vessel from within. In a few hours, the symbol of Japan's naval modernization vanished beneath the Pacific. Her loss represented more than the destruction of a ship. It erased the irreplaceable skill, discipline, and technical knowledge of her seasoned crew, an institutional void that Japan could no longer fill as the war dragged toward its close.
The catastrophe over the Marianas in June 1944 revealed a set of military truths that would echo throughout the remainder of the Pacific campaign. The Marianas Turkey Shoot, as it came to be known, proved decisively that technology, training, and organization, not zeal or tradition, determined victory in modern aerial warfare. From that point onward, Japan fought on the defensive, relying on increasingly futile measures to slow the American advance. The once formidable Japanese carrier arm, feared in 1941 for its daring and precision, was by now broken beyond repair. In contrast, the American task forces, once hunted and vulnerable, had evolved into unstoppable instruments of projection, capable of striking any target within range of their growing fleets. This transformation was not accidental, but the deliberate product of industrial and strategic evolution. The United States harnessed the full potential of its democratic system, its factories, scientists, and naval architects to wage total war. The synergy of production and innovation turned American carriers into the dominant capital ships of the age. What had begun as a desperate effort to survive after Pearl Harbor culminated in offensive mastery that no autocratic military command could match. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was the visible result of that progression. In the aftermath, American carriers continued to operate freely off Saipan, providing constant air cover for invasion forces. The Japanese remnants, stripped of coordination and aircraft, withdrew beyond the reach of American fighters. With no meaningful resistance left, the U.S. advanced steadily across the Central Pacific. Within months, newly captured airfields on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam hosted the massive B-29 superfortresses that would bring the war to Japan's home islands. The carrier clash intended to stop that outcome instead accelerated it, proving that American naval air power could project strength to any point on the map, regardless of distance or opposition. For those who fought it, June 19, 1944 became a day of historic reckoning.
Veterans of Task Force 58 would later recall that morning as the moment U.S. naval aviation achieved absolute superiority over its Japanese counterpart. Years of disciplined training, production, and tactical refinement converged in a few hours of air combat that annihilated Japan's offensive capacity at sea. The Grumman F6F Hellcat, engineered for ruggedness, simplicity, and firepower, stood at the center of that achievement. Its pilots, products of standardized and methodical training programs, demonstrated that modern war favored not a handful of gifted aces, but the consistent competence of many. The lessons drawn from this engagement reshaped naval aviation for decades to come. Future aircraft would be designed with pilot survival and durability as guiding principles, rather than as afterthoughts. The battle validated radar-directed fighter coordination as a central element of fleet defense, and underscored how industrial capacity, scientific ingenuity, and doctrinal flexibility could overwhelm any opponent anchored to outdated ideals. In broader perspective, the victory reflected democracy's ability to mobilize its collective strength effectively when facing authoritarian aggression. Yet beneath the triumph lay profound human tragedy. The sky over the Philippine Sea was filled not only with machinery, but with the final hopes of hundreds of young men. Many Japanese aviators, barely out of training, took off believing they were defending their homeland's honor. Instead, they faced an enemy they could scarcely see before being cut down in minutes. Their courage could not alter the arithmetic of material superiority. For every aircraft that fell, Japan lost another irreplaceable pilot, another link in a chain of experience that could never be rebuilt. Those who survived their missions often returned burdened by guilt, haunted by the disappearance of their comrades in battles they could not influence.
The contrast between the two nations' aircraft symbolized the broader divide in their war philosophies. The F6F Hellcat embodied a pragmatic approach, one that favored pilot protection, stable handling, and reliability over the fragile brilliance of high-performance extremes. American pilots could make mistakes and still live to fight another day. The Japanese Mitsubishi Zero, in contrast, demanded perfection. It rewarded skill, but punished the slightest error with death, a design that assumed an endless supply of elite flyers, something Japan no longer possessed. The Zero's strengths in agility and range became irrelevant when flown by novices facing heavily armored adversaries. These opposing design choices reflected deeper cultural values. One side prioritized human survivability as an essential resource, while the other accepted sacrifice as a necessary price of victory. By 1944, that philosophical difference determined the outcome as surely as the weapons themselves. The Battle of the Philippine Sea ended the era when Japan and the United States contested the skies as near equals. From that point on, aerial combat ceased to be a duel between opponents of comparable skill. It became an execution carried out by an industrial superpower against a nation running out of both machines and men. On the morning of June 19, 1944, hundreds of Japanese aviators lifted off from their carrier decks, unaware that they were flying towards certain destruction. The battle plan that once promised decisive victory instead delivered them into a meticulously prepared trap. Against the disciplined coordination and technological precision of the American defenses, their chances of success were non-existent. What unfolded over the Philippine Sea that day was less a contest of skill and courage than a demonstration of overwhelming imbalance, a mechanized slaughter that Allied pilots would later describe as a turkey shoot. The phrase, though crude, captured the grim reality of a battle where one side's superiority in aircraft design, radar control, and pilot training rendered resistance meaningless. The strategic repercussions of the so-called Marianas Turkey Shoot extended far beyond the immediate loss of aircraft. Japan's naval air arm, already weakened by years of attrition, suffered a blow from which it would never recover.
In a few hours, the Imperial Navy lost not only hundreds of aircraft, but the irreplaceable human capital that sustained its operational competence. Each downed pilot represented years of investment, countless flight hours, specialized instruction, and combat experience that wartime crash programs could not reproduce. The new recruits trained under emergency conditions lacked both the tactical finesse and the confidence that had once defined Japan's elite aviators. As veteran instructors and combat leaders perished, the transmission of institutional knowledge abruptly ceased, leaving behind a hollow structure that no amount of patriotic fervor could fill. The qualitative decline of Japan's air forces became a self-perpetuating collapse. The inexperienced pilots who replaced the fallen veterans entered combat with minimal training, facing a technically superior enemy that dictated the terms of every engagement. With each operation, the disparity widened. Losses mounted faster than replacements could be produced, and the cumulative effect was irreversible. The air wings that had terrorized the Pacific early in the war were reduced to fragile remnants, struggling merely to survive in the skies dominated by American machines and doctrine.
At the heart of this transformation stood the Grumman F6F Hellcat, a fighter that embodied the American philosophy of practical engineering and survivability. Its rugged airframe, self-sealing fuel tanks, and heavy 6-gun armament gave ordinary pilots extraordinary effectiveness. Unlike the delicate Zero, which demanded perfection from its aviators, the Hellcat tolerated mistakes. It was an aircraft designed not for the gifted few, but for the many, an instrument through which mass production and standardized training could achieve battlefield dominance. Combined with radar-directed interception and tightly integrated fleet coordination, the Hellcat turned carrier task groups into self-contained fortresses in the sky. The battle over the Marianas thus represented more than a tactical triumph. It was a validation of an entire system of warfare. The United States had transformed its industrial potential into a disciplined war machine, integrating technological innovation with mass education and operational analysis. What Japan viewed as spiritual strength and individual valor proved powerless against a society that applied science and organization to every facet of war. The events of that June morning revealed the fundamental difference between an empire fighting through ideology and a democracy fighting through industry. In the aftermath, the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force effectively ceased to exist as an offensive weapon. The very ships that once projected Japanese power across the Pacific now floated defenseless, unable to mount meaningful air operations. In contrast, American carriers operated with impunity. Their air groups replenished and upgraded at a pace Japan could not hope to match. The transformation was absolute. In less than 3 years, the U.S. Navy had evolved from the shattered remnants of Pearl Harbor to the undisputed master of the Pacific skies. The Marianas Turkey Shoot entered the annals of history as the moment when American naval aviation attained irreversible superiority. The engagement marked a turning point not only in the Pacific War, but in the evolution of modern warfare itself. It demonstrated that industrialized democracies could translate economic power into decisive military capability through coordination, innovation, and training. Where autocratic systems relied on heroism and discipline, the United States relied on data, production, and process, and proved that these forces, when fully mobilized, were unbeatable. By the end of that fateful day, the skies above the Philippine Sea belonged entirely to America. Japan's surviving aviators limped back to their carriers, stunned by the scale of their defeat. The myth of invincibility that had once surrounded the Zero and its pilots was gone forever. What replaced it was the grim recognition that courage alone could not compensate for material inferiority. The Marianas Turkey Shoot was not merely a battle, but a revelation that in the modern age, wars would be won not by spirit, but by systems.